Alrighty, how's everybody enjoying their dessert? Always the toughest part of the programming, right? When you get a bunch of people who are really good at speaking, getting them to stop speaking when the program's moving on is always one of the biggest challenges. I remember when I was a teacher, teachers did that too. But dessert, good stuff? All right, well, so get ready. Everybody save room for second dinner? Yeah, okay, good. Second dinner's coming. Some people are very puzzled right now. Wait, there's a second dinner? There's not a second dinner. I was just kidding. Some of you are disappointed now, and I apologize for getting your hopes up. But earlier I spoke a little bit about optimism and the power of long-term optimism that can make an impact. So tonight, to have a little bit of a program and a conversation tonight, we have a couple of great examples who are about to take the stage that show the power of long-term impact. So first, we're delighted to have all the way from Washington, D.C. Actually, Rachel, Joanne, and I were all coast to coast. Yesterday we were all in Washington, D.C. Today we're all in Simi Valley. So it's the bi-coastal team. Next we're going to Hawaii. We're just going to keep going westward until we make our way circumnavigating the globe. But Rachel Hoff, who serves as the policy director at the Ronald Reagan Institute, which is the Washington, D.C. office of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. In terms of the topic we'll explore tomorrow, the relevance of peace through strength in the modern world, Rachel is one of the finest minds in the country when it comes to defense policy, so be sure to pick her brain for any questions you have that are lingering before tomorrow's debates. Before joining the Institute, she was a communications director and policy advisor for John McCain at the Senate Armed Services Committee. She's also conducted research and outreach for a number of think tanks in Washington, including American Enterprise Institute, American Action Forum, and the Foreign Policy Initiative. She also worked as a legislative assistant for Congressman Mac Thornberry. She's worked and volunteered for numerous campaigns and organizations and has represented Washington, D.C. twice as a delegate to the RNC and served on the 2016 GOP Platform Committee. So we'll invite her to the stage in just a second. And here to interview her and learn a little bit more about what it means to work in policy in D.C. is Odysseus Pyrinis. Odysseus just graduated from UC Berkeley and is actually sticking around for another year to get his master's degree. And he's one of our summer interns this summer, but he's no stranger to the Reagan Library. He took a field trip here in the 5th grade and then attended our student leadership program, was the recipient of one of our GE Reagan scholarships, went to Washington, D.C. as part of our leadership in the American Presidency program. We're currently working out the deals of a lifetime contract because, as we talked about earlier today, once you become part of the Reagan EDU family, we never let you leave. We like to keep you around. Please join me in welcoming Odysseus and Rachel to the stage.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for taking the time. You were flown into D.C. and for being here to share with us your experiences and your wisdom in public policy. So I'd like to start off by just asking you, why public policy? What is it that you wake up every morning and you just are driven to pursue a professional career in public policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, and just first of all, thanks so much for having me here. It's really great to meet so many of you in person. I'm really excited for tomorrow. I've seen some of you along your debate journey in some of the regional qualifiers, so it's great to be here in person back at the Reagan Library. And I think I've been here in 2 years, even though I work in the DC office. Public policy, it's a great question, Odysseus. I think when I was coming up in high school and then in college, I don't know that I really had an understanding of what a career in public policy meant. I knew about politics, and I knew that I was interested in politics. I studied political science in undergraduate as a university student. And when I moved to DC, there was like a whole new world that really opened up in terms of loads and loads of people who are there for a common purpose. And I think that purpose, fundamentally, when we talk about careers in public policy, is that you want to change the world and that you really believe that you can do it. And there are a lot of, when I was kind of coming up in high school and college, I knew folks that wanted to maybe run for office or be a politician. But I didn't know about the careers, whether it was on Capitol Hill but not a member of Congress, or at think tanks. Tony mentioned I've worked at a number of think tanks, or at places like this, the DC office at the Ronald Reagan Institute. Day to day, we're working on public policy issues. And those jobs are really there to engage with the issues of the day, to try to make a difference for causes that you believe in and that you're passionate about. And what's great, I think, about public policy careers is that there's no uniformity in kind of what drives and motivates people other than that sort of foundational motivation of wanting to create change and having a passion to do so. So some people may be working on education policy, others on healthcare policy. For me, it's been foreign policy and national security. And of course, within any one of those issues, it's not just right and left, but a whole spectrum in between that folks are kind of approaching from different angles. And what I love about it is that foundational motivation is the same. And so there's so much kind of camaraderie among folks that are pursuing careers in public policy, and that we wake up every day, like you said, kind of with that really motivational attitude and that optimism, I think, that Tony was talking about earlier.
Phenomenal. You mentioned that you did not actually major in public policy in college. It was instead political science. Is that correct?
Yes.
So one thing that I would be interested in knowing more about is because now universities and other institutions, they're starting to adopt an actual separate public policy department that you can either major or minor in. So for undergraduates who are going to be starting their college career, what are some of the steps that you would recommend that they take? Either, in undergraduate, the first 2 years, should they pursue political science, or should they be also exploring maybe some of these more dedicated public policy departments?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're right to point out kind of that shift in academia that's happening. When I was an undergraduate, I went to Tufts University outside Boston, and there was no public policy option. Political science was kind of it, and international relations if you wanted to focus on the foreign policy side. And actually, by the time I went back to get my graduate degree, which I did at the University of Texas at Austin, I ended up at a school of public policy at the graduate level. And so I got to kind of explore that aspect of academia that you point to. At the same time, while that is kind of an emerging field in academia, I don't know that I would necessarily say that that's the only path to have a career in public policy. Political science and international relations remain, I think, viable options for folks that want to study that. But also history, philosophy. I mean, even some of the sciences, if you have kind of a more niche interest and want to develop a niche expertise within a career in public policy. Journalism, right? I think, especially within the liberal arts, but even outside, I know you study engineering. Maybe you want to do sort of a hard science career, but maybe you want to kind of focus on the more scientific aspects of public policy. And so I don't know that I would recommend kind of a particular major, public policy or otherwise. I think you really have to examine not just what you are passionate about, what you care about, what you're drawn to, but also kind of where your academic skills align, whether it's more on the philosophy side, thinking and writing, or historical side with research and kind of access to archival texts, and then sort of make a decision within kind of that umbrella based on what is inside of you rather than what's ahead of you.
And Rachel, I really like that you bring up the robustness of public policy, that you're not just limited into the social sciences fields, but you can, as you mentioned, you can also be from an engineering background, and there is still a space for you to fill in public policy. So that segues to another question I have for you, and that is, in the public policy field, since you have a lot of experience and a successful profession in DC in public policy, what exactly do you do every day? Is it, who do you work with, the diversity of the backgrounds in terms of degrees? Just kind of give us a glimpse into what you do in your life.
Yeah, I think probably some of my colleagues here in California will be as interested to hear the answer to that question as some of the students, because DC is sort of a foreign world in many ways. Well, let me break it out into a couple different areas. I'll talk about my current job at the Reagan Institute. I'll talk about my background at think tanks, and then particularly on Capitol Hill, just briefly touch on each of those three. So the Ronald Reagan Institute, you heard from Joanne at lunch. She can certainly tell you much more about the origin of the Ronald Reagan Institute as part of the foundation and institute in much more detail than I can, because it was started before I came on board. But as best I understand it, the leadership of the Reagan Foundation said, this is an amazing library. We've got a great museum. We have the foundation team that do great work here to preserve the history of the Reagan legacy. When it comes to public policy, particularly at a federal level, the action's in Washington, D.C., and so let's create an institute there to promote the Reagan legacy, not just to kind of preserve as happens here in the museum. And I think that's done in the Reagan Foundation and Institute case, not just in DC, but here in California as well through programs like this, which aren't just about, you're not debating necessarily the topics of the 1980s, but you're debating the policy challenges of today's world. And that's exactly what we do at the Reagan Institute. We take the Ronald Reagan lens, the lens of President Reagan's values, his principles, his leadership, and we look at the policy challenges of today's world. So I work primarily on our national security and foreign policy programs. I'll give you two examples of things that I do. One is that I run a program related to national security and technology. So things like artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, 5G and computer networking, quantum computing, things that you probably understand a lot better than me with your engineering degree. But what I understand is that they matter in terms of our national security. And even though Ronald Reagan wouldn't have understood those technologies in the context of the 1980s, he would have known that he would have said that if there were technologies important to our national security that we were falling behind on as a nation, that we need to get after that problem. And so this project works to recommend policy changes to better integrate new emerging technologies into our national security. The second is on freedom and democracy. So how do we think about advancing freedom around the world, something that was core to Reagan's legacy in the 80s, through the lens of today's world, whether it's how technology has changed things or kind of how authoritarianism is on the rise around the world. Maybe I'll actually talk a little bit more about think tanks and working in Congress a little bit later, but that's kind of the day-to-day of what I do now.
Very interesting, Rachel. Thank you for sharing all of that. And since we have a very large group of aspiring leaders that might want to go into the public policy field, what kind of opportunities are available for undergraduate students in DC who are interested in either going into a think tank or maybe public office? And what recommendations would you give them in terms of seeking out those opportunities?
Well, the number one best undergraduate opportunity available in Washington, D.C. is the Ronald Reagan Leadership in the American Presidency program, of course, of which you are an alum. Strongly recommend for folks that are interested in kind of getting a sense of what DC is all about. You get college credit, and then you also do an internship where you're getting some hands-on experiences. That's the best, but there are, of course, a lot of programs like that where you can kind of bridge your academic experience that you're going into in college and that hands-on experience of being at an internship, whether you're on Capitol Hill, maybe in a federal agency, a lobbying organization, a journalism, a media organization working in journalism, or a think tank. And I think anything along those lines can kind of get you some hands-on experience in the field where you can get a taste for what you like, what you don't like, what you're good at, what you're not good at. I did a lot of internships in college that didn't necessarily end up being what I wanted to do, but it was as valuable for me at the time to learn what I didn't want to do, because I could kind of shut the door, at least for the moment, on those opportunities and focus more on the opportunities that were kind of appealing to me as my career unfolded.
And I can also vouch, like Rachel mentioned, LTAP is a phenomenal program. It allowed me to get university course credits, and I also had an internship in Capitol Hill, in the Capitol building. So an absolutely phenomenal experience. We also got to connect with some think tanks, which also I want to ask you more about the dynamics between a public office and think tanks, since you also, as Tony introduced, were working for Senator McCain's office, which was a public office, but you also have an extensive resume in the private sector of think tanks. And I'd like to know a little bit more about what kind of experiences you had in both a public office and private. What are some of the pitfalls or disadvantages? What are the highlights? And just the general dynamics of being inside a public work environment versus a private work environment in DC.
Sure. Well, the major difference for me was that I get a lot more sleep when I'm working at think tanks than I do when I work in Congress, because I worked for Senator McCain for about a year and a half, and I worked for this member of Congress from Texas in the House of Representatives for about 2 years. And your life is not your own, your schedule is not your own. You can't eat lunch when you're hungry. You have to eat lunch when the boss is, in a meeting that you don't have to be in, and all of that. And the hours are long, and the pay, spoiler alert, is not great. Think tanks, kind of from that sort of outside perspective that you mentioned, are really there to, I view it as sort of the outsourced kind of research and development work of government. As I mentioned, the pace of being, say, a Capitol Hill staffer, or I've never worked in administration or in the executive branch, but the pace there is just such that you don't, you're dealing with the incoming every day, you're dealing with kind of the urgent, and there isn't as much time to think about, big ideas and big solutions, and that's a role that think tanks can fill. They have an interesting history kind of coming out of the university academia space, but now they're these standalone organizations where smart people at all levels, including kind of research assistants who are 22 and fresh out of college, up to folks kind of mid-career, and then very senior people who maybe have spent a career in government and then come out, and it's sort of their off-ramp to retirement, sort of writing papers and speaking at events, and they're really able to have that broader perspective, the more long-term approach, saying what are the biggest problems and what are the public policy solutions we need in order to fix those problems. And then they get to advocate for those solutions. Not necessarily, lobbying is something different from a legal perspective, but they get to go to Capitol Hill or to an administration, to executive branch agencies, and here's my report or my my white paper, and try to achieve some impact. And that, like for example, on that project I mentioned, and here's where the Ronald Reagan Institute in some ways is similar to a think tank, although we're part of a presidential foundation. We have a report that we put out on technology and national security, and I spent about a year working with a whole lot of people on developing and writing that report, and then I spent about a year trying to achieve impact for that report, doing briefings for members of Congress, for committee staff on Capitol Hill, for the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and trying to sort of create change across activating some policy levers. And so it can be exciting to do that work, but it's also exciting to be on the other side and working. Do not seek to be in elected office at any point, but kind of working for elected officials where you actually have control over some of those public policy levers.
So Rachel, if I could ask you, since you worked on the Senate side, but on the congressional side, which I assume is very similar, there are legislative staffers that work in the office that do a lot of public policy research and advise the elected officials on what kind of policy they should advocate on the Senate or House floor. So when you are positioning the think tanks as an external consulting group of sorts, how frequently have you been approached by elected congressional officials or from the Senate side, and do they actually use the information that you prepare from the think tanks? What kind of dynamic do you have? Is it like a very formal relationship between Congress and think tanks, or is it more informal, they just follow along with the reports that are issued?
Every single time they say, whatever you say, Rachel, I'm going to do it. No, absolutely not. It is more of that dynamic kind of back and forth, like you mentioned, and I think that's part of the integrity of the system, is that there's a lot of transparency there, and there's a lot of proper sort of division of labor, if you will, between the folks who are in elected office, the professional staff members working at committees or in personal offices on the Senate or House side, and then the people kind of developing some of those bigger ideas and advocating for them on the Hill. I would say, more success with certain projects than others in terms of getting folks to pay attention and create change. Maybe I'll share one little anecdote since I've been talking about this project on technology and national security. We came up with a bunch of recommendations in the report, but we highlighted 5 of them. And one of the 5 was to create a new type of visa. And when my colleagues and I were debating kind of internally what we would highlight from our recommendations, I, to be honest, said, we probably shouldn't recommend creating a new kind of visa. Like, if you haven't noticed, like, immigration reform on Capitol Hill is a little bit of a lightning rod. Not much is happening. There's political considerations on both sides. So are we kind of setting ourselves up for failure if we make this one of our top 5 recommendations and we're not able to achieve it? And to my surprise, it was actually the one that made it fairly far along in the process. We had one of the top 5 recommendations that was actually signed into law, so that was cool. And then this one made it the second furthest. It was passed in the House version of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a defense bill that goes through the Armed Services Committee every year. And then during the Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law, it was not in the Senate legislation. And then during the conference committee where they negotiated out the differences, it ended up getting dropped because one senator who wasn't even on the committee had an objection to it. But But it was so cool to sort of work with, when we work in an educational capacity, which is how think tanks work as well, not a lobbying capacity like I mentioned, but just to say, here's a good idea. Our report was bipartisan. We had leaders from both sides of the aisle contribute to the report, and so we were able to say this idea has been vetted. It has a bipartisan stamp of approval. These, experts, former government officials, leaders from industry and academia think this would help solve this problem. And that's a pretty attractive thing if you're a member of Congress or the staff of a member of Congress who's kind of looking for good ideas to, to put in a bill every year. And so that's just a little anecdote about maybe one story along the way.
And I'd like to focus a little bit more on the educational capacity of think tanks, because I know, for example, American Enterprise Institute, which you worked at, they offer support for the executive councils in undergraduate institutions and colleges. And so I'd like for you to speak a little bit more on, since our audience will be attending their first year in undergraduate after, when they graduate from high school, if they want to get more engaged with the campus, such as in clubs or organizations, what are some of the possibilities that they can look forward to? I know I mentioned the Executive Council, but any other clubs or organizations that could pave their way to a route for public policy in the future?
Yeah, so there, like you said, are a whole host of clubs that are emerging on college campuses, I think especially in the last 5 or 10 years, that focus more specifically on public policy. American Enterprise Institute is one. They have these executive council, which are basically just college student organizations, just like you would have a campus branch of any other national organization, whether it was on the right or left. American Enterprise Institute is a center-right think tank, but one thing that they do through their clubs on campus is really, it's all about the conversation and about the debate. So it's not necessarily this is a club for conservative students to promote conservative ideas. It's much, much broader than that. Another, if anyone's interested in foreign policy and national security, there's a great national organization called the Alexander Hamilton Society. They were created, I'd say about 3 or 4 years before the blockbuster Broadway hit. So that was great timing on their part to name an organization after Alexander Hamilton. But he has a really important legacy on foreign policy and the founding of our country, vis-a-vis, in particular, Thomas Jefferson, who took a different approach. So that's a great campus organization, again, focused on dialogue and debate. You guys know much more about debate than I do, but they'll often bring in kind of a speaker to debate, bring in a speaker from outside campus to debate a professor who's on campus, and so kind of have that dialogue. But there are a number of organizations, of course, some focused on public policy, others that verge on the more political activism side. And my number one piece of advice, which is probably kind of implicit in your question, is whatever it is, just get involved. I think one of the best pieces of advice, both in undergraduate and in the early stages of your careers as young professionals, is to get involved in extracurriculars like it's your job, because one day it may actually be. And you guys are kind of doing that now by participating in programs like this. So I think you're one step ahead in that department.
Thank you, Rachel, for that advice. On a more lighthearted note, since you have had many years of experience working in DC, what would you say is the most embarrassing moment you've ever had on Capitol Hill?
Oh, too many to count for sure. One story that sticks out to me is when I was working for Senator McCain. So one thing you'll hear in politics and the public policy space a lot is proximity is power. So if you ever have a chance to choose your desk or your office, you don't want to choose the big corner office or the one with the best view or the one closest to the kitchen. You want to choose the one closest to the boss because that's where you really start to get that kind of access. And there's a lot of truth to that. So in Senator McCain's office, the way that they had it set up was the senator's office was here and right next to it, and he had to walk in and out of his office through this other office. And that office housed his chief of staff, his scheduler, his communications director, his press secretary, and me. I was his speechwriter at the Armed Services Committee. And even though I worked at the committee, which is a whole separate staff that had an office down the hall, they knew that in order to be successful as a speechwriter, I had to have access to the person who I was writing speeches for. And so there I was with all these people who had worked for him for years. And my first week in office, somebody sent me an article. Are you guys familiar with The Onion? Okay, there's a publication, an online publication similar to The Onion called Duffel Blog that is like a defense military oriented, maybe some people have heard of it, kind of specific publication. And one of my friends, knowing that from off of Capitol Hill, knowing that I had just started to work for Senator McCain, sent me this article that was funny, but like a little bit in poor taste. It was like that Senator McCain, and these are fake articles, right, like The Onion, Senator McCain was outraged when he went to try to book a stay at the Hilton Hotel that his rewards points through Hilton had expired from his time at the Hanoi Hilton, which was the nickname for the POW camp where he spent many years during Vietnam. And this was like an article that was going around and people thought it was funny and it had all these little anecdotes about Senator McCain. And one of my colleagues sees me reading it over my shoulder and she's like, oh, what is that? And I'm like, oh, it's just this article, never mind, it's not funny. And she reads it and she was like, no, that's hilarious. You have to show that to the senator. He'll think it's amazing. And I was like, I can't show this to the senator. Like, is this some sort of like hazing ritual? Like I'm new on the job and you're trying to like put me in this awkward situation? And she was like, no, trust me, he'll think it's funny and he'll think it's amazing that you brought it to him and you should totally show it to him. So probably against my better judgment, I did. And she was right, he thought it was hilarious. There were all these kind of very John McCain sort of references throughout the article about, kind of back when he ran for president and just all these little details. And he thought it was so funny. And he didn't tweet. He was on Twitter, but he did not tweet himself. But he would often dictate tweets for our social media person to write out. And frankly, he was better at social media than the 25-year-old who was who was technically in charge of social media, because he had that wit and that sense of humor. And he like hand wrote a tweet that we should attach to the article on the piece of paper and handed it back to me and said, make sure they put that on the Twitter. And so it was potentially even more embarrassing than it was. But in the moment, I was mortified that I was going to get fired about 4 days into the job.
Well, thank you for sharing that wonderful story, Rachel. I think we have time for a couple more questions for me. So I know before you worked with John McCain that you also helped to found your own think tank in DC, along with some other people, the Foreign Policy Initiative. So if you could also talk a bit about what was in your mind going into just helping another organization come into DC for public policy. What were some of the challenges and what were the goals you had in mind when you envisioned it?
So I think one of the things that I love most about DC is that it's a really dynamic place. So you have organizations, like when it comes to think tanks, that have been around for decades, right? You have the Heritage Foundation, the Brookings Institution, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, these really like institutional organizations, both on left and right. And then you have organizations that sort of pop up for a period of time for a particular reason, are super active, and then kind of go away. And the Foreign Policy Initiative was the latter. And it was so cool to be a part of it. I remember when we were, I was a small, of course, a team effort that was starting it, but one of our board members who started it, I asked him about the name. Foreign policy is kind of, natural, because we focused on foreign policy. But why initiative? And he said exactly that. We're not the Foreign Policy Institute. We don't want to be institutional. We're an initiative for a particular period of time. In that particular case, it was 2009. Republicans had just lost political power in the White House and in both houses of Congress. And there was kind of a perception that there would be a lack of leadership on the center right when it came to foreign policy issues, both to hold the new administration and the new leadership in Congress accountable when we felt like they were missing the mark, and also to support them when they were doing the right thing. So actually our very first conference at Foreign Policy Initiative, which had a cast of very, traditional kind of Republican foreign policy names involved, our very first conference was in February of 2009. Barack Obama was 1 month into office. He decided to surge more troops to Afghanistan, and we held a conference on Afghanistan policy, largely supporting the administration's decision. And actually Senator McCain, who only 4 months earlier had lost the election to Barack Obama, came and stood on stage and delivered a speech publicly supporting the administration's decision. And so I think that's a really important lesson from that organization too, is too often, especially these days, 2009 seems like a lifetime ago in many ways, probably especially for a high school crowd. But some of your parents may feel like I do, that it wasn't that long ago, and somehow in that time we've lost kind of that sense of organizations that are really just there on principle to support, ideas and not necessarily knee-jerk reactions on one side or the other.
And as a final question for you, Rachel, what is one life-learned advice that you would like to pass on to our audience?
Well, I actually just heard one of the best pieces of advice the other day from somebody far more junior than me at our organization who said, or far younger than me at least at our organization, who said that when he moved to DC, he was told, and you should consider this in your time here as well, whenever you use the bathroom, you should wash your hands and then dry them fully before leaving the restroom, because what if you run into like a member of Congress or a senator or some sort of very important person? Do you want to shake their hand with a wet hand from having just washed your hands? So I thought that was like a very practical piece of advice. And I'm going to implement that in my own life. But I think the best kind of career advice that I've had is that it's useful to plan, but you have to be equally kind of willing to diverge from your plan. So I assume as some high-achieving high school students, you all have ideas maybe about where you want to go to college, what you want to study, maybe what you want to do for your summer internships or after college, even careers that you might be interested in. And that's all really useful. But if I may quote another president here at the Reagan Library, President Eisenhower, before he was president, of course, was general of the armies of Europe. And during World War II, he said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And so what you learn during that planning process about your own preferences, about your goals, your ambitions, what drives you, what motivates you, what you're passionate about, that's what's useful in the planning process, not necessarily I'm going to graduate from Berkeley, and then I'm going to go get my master's degree in engineering, and then I'm going to go to law school, and these are the timelines that I'm going to do that. That's a great plan, and if that ends up happening, you're going to be successful. And if that doesn't end up happening, you're still going to be successful, because it's true of all of you that there in your life there will be different paths to success, and those are sort of the options in front of you. So don't be so locked into kind of one course of action for your life. A lot of people much more senior and important than me will tell the stories of their career, and it ends up being, then I was in the right place at the right time, and this person offered me a job, and it just happened, as opposed to something that was more directed.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for those words of wisdom. I think now we can open it up for a few questions to the audience. So if you just raise your hand if you have a question, there should be a mic that Megan will be passing around. And Colleen, I'm sorry. Megan and Colleen
Ask good questions, because otherwise these ladies are going to have to grill me. So I don't want to know what question Megan would ask.
I told you guys, you're so used to putting people in the hot seat, debaters. Let's hear it.
There's one back there.
All right, Eugene, I like it. Way to be brave, my friend. Yeah, Eugene.
I was just wondering, do you see the need for young people like us, or high schoolers, or just like people who are in school right now, do you see the need for young individuals to go into your type of field? And if so, could you give us an elevator pitch, or just like a reason? I know this might seem like a lot, but like give us a reason why we should go into this field.
Well, number one, I do see a huge need for young people to get into this field. I think public policy in particular is really revitalized, reanimated, energized by the constant flow of young people coming in. And I think it's very much, it needs that energy in order to stay innovative. And I think anybody looking at the way that Washington works today who doesn't think that we need a new generation of leadership would have to give me a pretty solid elevator pitch. So I hope that people like you do get involved. I think what I would say in terms of this career versus other careers is, number one, you can have a lot of responsibility at a very young age. It's climbing the ladder in whether it's in DC or in state capitals. I've talked a lot about DC because that's my background. But whether it's public policy or politics, you can have a huge amount of responsibility as a young person in a way that other careers you'd have to work for decades before you actually get to kind of do the sort of hands-on kind of cool stuff. And then number two, back to kind of where I started. If you want to make a difference in a macro sense, there's nothing like changing laws and kind of policy, pulling those policy levers in order to help the American people, because fundamentally, you know, the word that I haven't used, which I should have much earlier, is public service, right? This career is about serving the American people, and we think about that a lot when we think of elected officials, of course, but there's a whole lot of other people who support those elected officials, both in their offices and in other organizations in the broader enterprise, that are there because they want to make things better for the American people. And I find that, you know, a couple decades into this career, motivating on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. Okay. I just first want to say thank you so much for obviously talking with all of us and sharing all your thoughts. It's been great to hear. And I wanted to ask, what was it specifically about foreign policy that interested you? Thank you.
I'll give you the sort of cynical answer, and then I'll give you a real answer. The cynical answer is another kind of one of those funny career stories where things just end up happening. I studied political science, like I said, and I was mostly interested in domestic politics. And when my first job was at the American Enterprise Institute, the think tank we were talking about earlier, and I was supposed to go to work actually on education policy. And I was excited about that. And then I got a job on a campaign, and I said, can I delay my start date 3 months at the think tank? And they said yes. And then the week before I started my job, when the campaign was over, I wrote to them and said, okay, I'm super excited to start my job. And they said, oh yeah, we filled that education policy job. And I think they kind of forgot that I was coming. And I think they might have sent out an all-staff email that said, does anybody want a research assistant for a year? And the foreign policy department raised their hand. And that's how I got into foreign policy. What happened after that, though, was that I loved it. And that I think for me, I was actually born and raised overseas on US military bases. My parents didn't work for they were not in uniform as service members, but they were civilians who worked as teachers at the school on the military bases overseas. And I think kind of growing up in that era, living overseas was one of the only ways to kind of, or traveling, were the two ways to kind of get that global perspective. For your generation, that global perspective, I think, is handed to you if you want it, because of the way, especially that social media and technology have interconnected our world. And foreign policy for me, I mean, I have all sorts of like little things I'm interested in within foreign policy for specific reasons, but at the biggest level, it's a way to kind of think about the world much bigger than just, of course, me, my community, and my country, but how can we actually improve through American leadership, especially the whole world.
Like Casey said, thank you for coming and talking to us and answering questions. That this was really interesting for me to listen to. I wanted to kind of ask, I know that you mentioned about the process that you went through in kind of introducing policy ideas from think tanks in the private sector to Congress people. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about the process that you have for coming up with those policy ideas, whether it's, you know, deciding which areas to address and then actually drafting those potential bills and laws. Like, what is the process that you and your colleagues go through to be able to introduce those ideas?
Yeah, it's a great question. Traditionally, at formal think tanks, and then I'll talk about Reagan Institute, at formal think tanks, they employ a variety of scholars that are experts in their own ways across any number of broad policy topics and then specific policy topics, right? So you might have, you know, immigration policy people and tax reform people and national security people and education experts. And then within those, you would have, you know, within foreign policy, you would have a China expert, a Middle East expert, maybe a human rights expert, a military expert. And for a large part, they're just kind of coming up with those ideas based on their experience and their education. So typically those people would either have a significant career in government or significant education within that subject area, or both. And they're kind of just coming up with the ideas because they're experts. At the Reagan Institute, we have a different model. We're not a think tank. We don't house scholars and experts in-house. We're a very small staff. And what we do is we convene the best and brightest across kind of key stakeholders in a particular topic. So when I'll go back to my continuing example of the Technology and National Security Project, we brought together, I think it was 13 experts who came. They were either current or former government officials on both sides of the aisle. It was bipartisan. Leaders from the technology sector, from companies, from traditional defense companies, from new defense companies doing cool things, you know, whether it's companies that build ships and planes and tanks, or companies that, you know, build microchips and drones, and some of these more emerging technology companies. And we put them in a room together every month over the course of 6 months. And my colleagues and I prepared briefings and structured discussion. And over the 6 months, we went through 6 different big topics that we thought were important to the problem and the solution, or the solutions. And month by month, they talked with each other, they met with these experts, and they together came up with these ideas, which we then sort of reflected in the report that came out with kind of that list of recommendations that I mentioned. So I think that's kind of a cool model to sort of not just have one smart person writing what they think is right, but to bring the smart people together, put them in conversation with each other. And then I think you get better ideas emerge because, you know, not just bipartisan, but also, you know, somebody who had a career at the Department of Defense is going to have a different perspective than somebody who's at a company trying desperately to sell drones to the Department of Defense to do, you know, some work protecting the human rights of the people in Ethiopia, but you know, not able to sort of connect those dots. And so bringing those key stakeholders kind of across industry, government, academia, I should mention too, and then kind of having them hash it out was our approach. And that's a model that we've recreated 2 or 3 other times.
Thank you so much for joining us here today. My question bounces a bit off of the last piece to the last question, and how think tanks and, well, there's a lot of interest on Capitol Hill, some of them being paid interest, someone trying to sell you drones that might have a monetary interest. In your experience fighting with what we consider as lobbyists, and how often did it go in the way of the intellectual qualified versus who had the most money? Was that something that was disheartening, something you saw a lot, or can we be a little more optimistic?
It's a good question, and I haven't talked a lot about lobbying. I've probably talked a lot about things that sound like lobbying, which is really advocacy. Lobbying is there's this very specific technical legal definition around what kind of capital L lobbying is, and that especially, there's kind of a nexus with the corporate space, but it's not all corporate, right? Like the University of California system has lobbyists in Washington. The National Association of Realtors has lobbyists in Washington, right? It's not all like I think the sort of big corporate boogeyman type lobbyists that, or what was the great documentary, Thank You for Smoking, the big, big tobacco type lobbyists, although those exist too. So in my experience, because especially I worked for Senator McCain, he was somebody who was very attuned to limiting the interest of corporate lobbyists in particular. And so I would say, and I don't think it was just for that reason, that the work that went on among the professional staff of, in this case, the Armed Services Committee, it was very much like anybody can come in, we'll meet with you, whether you're an expert, whether you're a company with some skin in the game, whether you're from a think tank or from a university, or a citizen of the United States of America, right? I mean, that happens more in the personal offices where constituents can come and meet with their members of Congress. But it was sort of a let 1,000 flowers bloom approach to ideas, and then let's talk among the professional staff about what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Now, maybe it's because I haven't been at the high enough echelons of power, but I never saw a case where I felt like that shouldn't have happened, except lobbyists wanted it to happen, and so it did.
And I think we have time for 2 more questions. One more.
Wow. Where will it land? Oh.
Hello, I'm Lauralee Godfrey. Thank you so much for being here. My question to you is, what would you argue is the most critical issue facing rising youth in public policy today?
That can't be a quick answer. I don't often speak to high schoolers, but I spoke with a group of high schoolers actually earlier this week in DC from all around the country. And one question I asked them, they're not yet age of registered to vote. And I said, like, who's the 2 options? Like, raise your hand if you're like excited to register to vote with one of the 2 major political parties. That was one option. Either one will do. You don't have to specify. And then the second option was like, I'm not jazzed about either political party. I'm either in between or further apart, or I reject the 2-party system. And 95% of the students were the non-2 major political parties. And so I think so many things in public policy, especially obviously at the federal level, but even at the state level, are very, politics are a team sport, and therefore policy is kind of defined a little bit by the 2-party system as well. And I think if your generation rejects that 2-party system, and there's some indication that the generation between you and I, sort of folks in their 20s, they're not registering with either of the 2 parties. And I think that's going to fundamentally change the way not only we do politics and elections, but also the way we do policy. And I think kind of what that means and what the ramifications of that are will be most interesting from a policy perspective, though I think all the conversation about it will be about elections and politics.
Well, thank you again, Rachel, for coming out here this evening to come talk to us and share your life experiences and your words of wisdom and the advice that you gave to our young aspiring leaders who will be the future of our nation. With that, if we could get a warm round of applause for Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you so much.